I still remember the exact moment everything changed. Not when Sergio kissed me, not when he told me the truth, not even when we finally admitted what we'd been hiding for years. It changed the second my phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. I was half asleep when I reached for it, expecting some spam call or maybe one of my coworkers forgetting about time zones again. Instead, Sergio's name flashed across the screen. That alone was strange. He hated calling people. If something wasn't an emergency, he'd text. I answered with my eyes barely open. Hello? For a few seconds, all I heard was breathing. Then, Trevor. His voice barely sounded like him. You awake? I am now. Another silence. I need you. Those three words immediately pulled me fully awake. What happened? He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. My wedding, another pause, isn't happening. I sat upright. What? They called it off. I blinked. What do you mean called it off? It's over. He sounded exhausted. Can you come? I didn't even ask another question. I'm on my way. Sergio and I had been best friends since we were 15. Back then, we were two awkward teenagers who bonded because neither of us could figure out how to survive freshman year without embarrassing ourselves. He was louder than me, more confident, the kind of guy who could walk into any room and somehow make everyone laugh within 5 minutes. I was quieter, more comfortable listening than talking. Somehow it worked. For almost 15 years, we went through everything together: college applications, bad jobs, terrible apartments, breakups, family drama. The kind of friendship where weeks could pass without talking, but nothing ever felt different once we met again. People constantly asked if we were brothers. Sometimes they even assumed we were a couple. We always laughed it off. Trust me, Sergio would joke. If Trevor had to date me, he'd lose his mind. I already lose my mind, I'd answer. Exactly. Everyone laughed, including me, because that was easier. Way easier than admitting I'd been in love with my best friend since I was 21. He never knew, or at least I thought he didn't. His apartment was only 15 minutes away. When he opened the door, I almost didn't recognize him, still wearing yesterday's jeans, wrinkled white t-shirt, eyes red, hair completely messed up. He looked like he hadn't slept. Inside, the apartment was chaos. Suit bags hung from chairs. Boxes filled with wedding decorations sat unopened. Half-written seating charts covered the dining table. There were flowers everywhere. The place looked frozen halfway through preparing for tomorrow, or today. The wedding had been scheduled for 4 o'clock that afternoon. I looked at him. What happened? He stared at the floor. Emma left. I frowned. What do you mean she left? He rubbed both hands over his face. She packed a suitcase. And? And she isn't coming back. I honestly couldn't process it. Emma and Sergio had been together almost 4 years. Sure, every couple argued, but canceling a wedding less than 24 hours beforehand, that wasn't normal. I stepped closer. Did you fight? No. Did something happen? He hesitated, then quietly said, She told me she couldn't marry someone who wasn't completely in love with her. The room went silent. I looked at him. What? Those were her exact words. He forced a smile that disappeared almost immediately. I asked what she meant. And? She said she'd been pretending not to notice for almost a year. A knot formed in my stomach. What was she talking about? Sergio looked straight at me, long enough that it started making me uncomfortable. Then he looked away again. I don't know. I wasn't sure I believed him. The rest of the night turned into damage control, calling family, canceling vendors, answering messages, trying to stop relatives from driving across 3 states. I stayed because he clearly couldn't do it alone. Around sunrise, we finally collapsed onto his living room couch. Neither of us had eaten, Neither of us had slept. He stared at the ceiling. You know what's funny? What? I don't even think I'm crying because she left. I turned toward him. What do you mean? I should be devastated. You are. I don't know. He sighed. It feels like I already lost something a long time ago. That sentence stayed with me because it sounded less like heartbreak and more like regret. I just didn't know what he regretted yet. By 8 that morning, the apartment had gone quiet. The non-stop phone calls had finally slowed down. Most of the close family members had been informed, the venue had been contacted, and the caterer had agreed to refund part of the deposit. It wasn't perfect, but at least the worst of the logistical nightmare was over. Sergio looked completely drained. Go get some sleep, I said. He shook his head. If I lie down, I'll just think. You've been awake for almost 24 hours. So have you. I'll survive. He gave me a tired smile. You always do. I walked into the kitchen and started making coffee, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. The apartment still looked like it was waiting for a celebration that would never happen. His tuxedo hung on the bedroom door. Two champagne bottles sat chilling in the refrigerator. Even the handwritten vows were lying on the counter, folded neatly beside a silver pen. I looked away. Something about seeing them felt wrong. Not because the wedding was cancelled, because it made everything feel painfully real. Around noon, the doorbell rang. Sergio didn't even move. I'll get it. Outside stood his older sister, Vanessa, carrying 2 bags of takeout. She hugged Sergio the second she stepped inside. I'm so sorry. He hugged her back, but only for a moment. I'm okay. She pulled back and looked him straight in the eyes. No, you're not. He didn't answer. The three of us ate in near silence until Vanessa suddenly looked at me. Trevor, yeah? Can I steal my brother for a minute? I nodded. Of course. They disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door behind them. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, really. But the apartment was small. Their voices carried. You can't keep lying. I wasn't. Emma knew. Please. How long? Then everything became too quiet to make out. A few minutes later, the bedroom door opened. Vanessa walked out first. She smiled politely at me, but her eyes looked worried. I'm heading home, I stood. I'll walk you out. Once we reached the hallway, she stopped before getting into the elevator. Trevor, yeah, she hesitated. Take care of him. I will. I mean, really take care of him. Something about the way she said it made me uneasy. I always have. She nodded slowly. I know. Then she added something I wasn't expecting. Sometimes people spend so long protecting someone else's happiness, she sighed, that they completely forget about their own. Before I could ask what she meant, the elevator doors opened. She stepped inside and left. When I came back into the apartment, Sergio was standing by the window. You heard us. It wasn't a question. A little, he nodded. Sorry. You don't have to apologize. He leaned against the glass. You know, Emma wasn't the first person I almost married. I looked at him. I remember. Years ago, before Emma, he'd been engaged for 6 months to someone named Claire. That relationship had ended too. Different reasons. At least that's what he'd always told everyone. I keep thinking, he laughed bitterly, maybe I'm just not built for this. What? Marriage. I shook my head. No. Then what is it? I searched for an answer. I don't know. He looked at me for a long moment. That's the problem. That evening we decided to leave the apartment. Not because either of us wanted to, because staying inside surrounded by unopened wedding gifts was becoming unbearable. We drove without a destination, just like we used to in college. Back then, whenever one of us had a bad day, we'd buy cheap burgers, get milkshakes, and drive around until everything felt smaller. Funny how some habits never disappeared. We ended up at the overlook outside town where we'd spent countless nights talking about life. The view hadn't changed. City lights stretched across the horizon. Cars crawled along the highway like tiny glowing dots. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Sergio broke the silence. Do you remember when we were 23? I laughed. That's a dangerous question. You told me we'd still be best friends when we were 40. I remember. You sounded so certain. I still am. He smiled. So am I. Then his smile faded. You know, he kept looking out at the city. I almost didn't ask you to be my best man. I frowned. What? It wasn't because I didn't want you there. Then why? He rubbed the back of his neck. Emma suggested maybe it would be easier. Easier? She thought we depended on each other too much. I stared at him. She actually said that? He nodded. I argued with her. What did you say? I told her you weren't just my best friend. He stopped speaking. I waited. What did you tell her? His voice dropped almost to a whisper. I told her you were the most important person in my life. I laughed awkwardly. Well, we've known each other forever. That's not what she meant. The words hit harder than I expected. I slowly turned toward him. What did she mean? Sergio finally looked at me. His expression was unreadable. She asked me a question. What question? He swallowed. She asked me. He stopped again. What? If losing her scared me as much as losing you. The wind rushed through the trees around us. Neither of us moved. Finally, I asked the only thing I could. What did you tell her? Sergio closed his eyes. I couldn't answer. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I wasn't tired, because Sergio's last words refused to leave my head. I couldn't answer. I'd known him for nearly 15 years, and yet, for the first time, I felt like there was an entire part of his life I had somehow missed. The next morning, my phone buzzed before I'd even gotten out of bed. Sergio, can you help me return the gifts? I stared at the message for a second before replying. Be there in 20. His apartment looked different in daylight, less like a place preparing for a wedding, more like a place recovering from one. The flowers had started to wilt. Half the decorations were gone, stacked neatly in boxes waiting to be returned. The giant welcome sign leaning against the wall read, Welcome to Emma and Sergio's forever. Sergio caught me looking at it. I keep forgetting it's there. He picked it up without another word and carried it into the storage closet. When he came back, he looked relieved. Better, I nodded. Better. We spent most of the morning loading unopened presents into my truck. Coffee makers, kitchen appliances, picture frames, a ridiculous fondue set neither of us remembered being on the registry. Who even buys this? I asked. Sergio shrugged. Someone who thinks melted cheese saves marriages. I laughed. So, nobody. For the first time in 2 days, he laughed too. It wasn't a big laugh, but it was real. Hearing it made my chest feel strangely lighter. I'd forgotten how much I missed that sound. By the fifth store, we were exhausted. We stopped at a small diner we'd been going to since college. The waitress recognized us immediately. Long time no see. Yeah, Sergio answered with a smile. Life got busy. She looked around. I thought you were getting married this weekend. Silence. I saw Sergio hesitate. Then he simply said, It didn't work out. Her smile softened immediately. Oh, I'm sorry. He nodded politely. It happens. After she walked away, I looked at him. You handled that well. He stirred his coffee. I've already said it 23 times. You counted? I had a lot of phone calls. While we waited for our food, I noticed something sitting on the edge of the table. His wedding band, still inside its small velvet box. You brought it? He followed my eyes. Oh, he picked it up. I forgot it was in my pocket. For a moment, he simply turned the ring over between his fingers. Then, without warning, he slid it across the table toward me. Hold on to it. I blinked. What? I don't want to throw it away. So keep it. I can't. Why? Because every time I see it, he stopped. I remember making promises I wasn't ready to make. I carefully pushed the box back toward him. I don't think I'm the person who should keep that. He looked at me. No, I think you are. Before I could ask what he meant, our food arrived. The conversation ended there. But the feeling didn't. That afternoon, as we drove back toward his apartment, Sergio suddenly asked, "Do you remember my bachelor party?" I laughed. How could I forget? It had been planned for the previous weekend, nothing wild, just 8 of us renting a cabin by the lake, fishing, grilling, poker, the kind of weekend Sergio actually enjoyed. It was fun, I said. It was. You barely drank. I know. You kept disappearing, though. He smiled faintly. I needed air. I frowned. You were gone a lot. I was. Something clicked. I came looking for you once. I know. You were sitting on the dock. He nodded. I remember. I'd found him staring across the water by himself around midnight. Back then, I'd assumed he was nervous about getting married. Now, I wasn't so sure. What were you thinking about that night? I asked. He looked out the passenger window. You. I almost missed the red light. What? I was thinking about you. I pulled the truck to a stop. The silence between us became almost unbearable. I don't understand. I know. Cars began moving again behind us. Someone honked. I slowly drove forward. Neither of us spoke for nearly 5 minutes. Finally, I need to ask you something. Okay. If Emma hadn't canceled the wedding, he swallowed, would you still have stood next to me? The question caught me off guard. Of course. Even if it hurt, I frowned. Hurt? He nodded. I've spent days wondering. Wondering what? If standing beside me while I married someone else, his voice cracked for the first time, would have broken your heart. I felt my grip tighten around the steering wheel. What are you talking about? He looked straight ahead. Vanessa told me years ago. Told you what? That you loved me. Everything inside me stopped. I stared at him. The truck drifted slightly before I corrected it. What did you say? I didn't believe her. His voice was barely above a whisper. I thought she was reading too much into our friendship. I couldn't breathe. Then why? Because after a while, he closed his eyes. I started seeing it too. Every secret I'd spent years bearing suddenly felt exposed. You knew? I wasn't sure. For how long? He let out a slow breath. Almost 3 years. I couldn't think, couldn't speak, couldn't even look at him. Finally, I managed one question. If you knew, why didn't you ever say anything? Sergio's answer came so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Because I was terrified of asking myself why I never wanted to lose you either. For the rest of the drive, neither of us spoke. Not because there wasn't anything to say, because there was too much. Every mile felt heavier than the last. I kept replaying his words in my head. Almost 3 years. 3 years. He'd known. 3 years of pretending not to notice the way I sometimes looked at him a second too long. 3 years of acting like everything between us was completely normal. I pulled into the parking lot of his apartment and shut off the engine. Neither of us reached for the door. Finally, I looked at him. You should have told me. Sergio stared at his hands. I know. I spent years convincing myself I was hiding it. You were, I frowned. What? You hid it well enough that I could pretend I was wrong. That wasn't the answer I expected. I don't understand. He leaned back in his seat and let out a long breath. Trevor, I wanted to believe you only loved me like a brother. And if I didn't? He closed his eyes. Then I would have had to ask myself why I couldn't let you go. We eventually made our way upstairs. The apartment felt even quieter than before. Sergio tossed his keys onto the counter and disappeared into the bedroom. When he came back, he was carrying a small cardboard box. I found something. He set it on the coffee table. Inside were old photographs, concert tickets, movie stubs, a faded baseball cap from high school, our lives packed into one box. I picked up a picture from our freshman year of college. We were standing outside our dorm after a rainstorm, soaked from head to toe because we'd decided to walk home instead of waiting for the bus. Sergio laughed when he saw it. I remember that. You insisted it wasn't raining hard. It wasn't. It absolutely was. I was optimistic. You were stubborn. Same thing. I smiled despite myself. Then I noticed another photo underneath. It was from his 26th birthday, the night he'd announced he was engaged to Emma. Everyone was smiling, everyone except me. I looked away almost immediately. Sergio noticed. You hated that picture. I didn't hate it. You avoided looking at it every time I showed it to people. I sighed. I was trying to be happy for you. You were. No, I shook my head. I wanted to be. The confession hung between us. I remember driving home that night, I admitted. I pulled over halfway because I couldn't see through the tears. Sergio looked like someone had punched him. You never told me. What would have been the point? He didn't answer, because there wasn't one. That evening the rain started, a steady summer storm that rattled against the windows. The power flickered once, then everything went dark. Seriously? Sergio muttered. I laughed. Perfect timing. He disappeared into a cabinet and came back with a couple of candles. Soon the apartment was lit by a warm, uneven glow. It reminded me of college. Back then, we'd lose power all the time in our terrible off campus apartment. Instead of complaining, we'd sit on the floor, eat whatever snacks we had left, and tell each other stories until the lights came back. Sergio smiled. You thinking what I'm thinking? I hope not. Pizza? I laughed. Definitely pizza. The delivery took almost an hour because of the weather. By the time it arrived, the storm had gotten worse. We ate cross-legged on the living room floor. Halfway through the second slice, Sergio suddenly asked, Can I ask you something? You've been asking me things all week. I know. This one scares me. I set my plate down. Go ahead. He hesitated for several seconds. When did you fall in love with me? I laughed quietly. I honestly don't know. Try. I leaned back against the couch. I think I searched for the memory. It was after my dad died. Sergio's expression softened. That had been 12 years earlier, the worst week of my life. I remember everyone telling me they were there if I needed anything. I smiled faintly. You didn't say that. What did I say? You showed up at my apartment with 2 sleeping bags. He laughed. Oh, you said, I'm staying until you stop pretending you're okay. His smile disappeared. I was there for almost a week. You barely left. I didn't want you to be alone. I looked at him. That's when it happened. I realized nobody had ever loved me the way you did. His eyes met mine. I know it wasn't romantic. It was just you. Silence settled over the room again. The rain tapped gently against the windows. Then Sergio spoke. I think he stopped himself. What? I think that's when I started getting scared. Scared of what? He looked into the candlelight instead of at me. Because taking care of you never felt like an obligation. His voice had become almost a whisper. It felt like home. My chest tightened. Sergio. I kept telling myself that's just what best friends feel. He laughed bitterly. Then every woman I dated eventually asked me the same question. What question? Why does it always feel like Trevor comes first? I didn't know how to answer, neither did he. After a long silence, he looked at me again. I spent years trying to prove everyone wrong. And did you? A sad smile crossed his face. My wedding was cancelled because I couldn't. The words landed like a stone between us. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Inside, neither of us moved. For the first time in 15 years, it felt like the truth wasn't something either of us could hide from anymore. Neither of us said much after that. The candles eventually burned low, the pizza boxes sat forgotten on the coffee table, and the storm outside settled into a steady rhythm. It was nearly midnight when Sergio stood up. You can take the bedroom. I shook my head. It's your apartment. I don't care. I'll sleep on the couch. He smiled faintly. You've always been stubborn. I learned from you. That earned a quiet laugh. For the first time since the wedding had fallen apart, the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply quiet. I woke up to the smell of coffee. For a second, I forgot where I was. Then I heard Sergio humming in the kitchen. It was the same tune he'd been absent mindedly humming since high school whenever he cooked. Some habits never changed. I walked into the kitchen to find him standing at the stove making pancakes. I raised an eyebrow. Pancakes? He shrugged. I figured we deserved something better than leftover pizza. I won't argue with that. He handed me a mug of coffee. Morning, morning. For a while, we talked about anything except the last 3 days: sports, work, a movie we'd both wanted to see. It almost felt normal. Almost. Then my phone buzzed. Emma, I frowned. You gonna answer? Sergio asked. I don't know. Go ahead. I stepped onto the balcony before picking up. Hello? Trevor. Her voice sounded tired. I wasn't sure you'd answer. I almost didn't. I figured. There was a long pause. I need to ask you something. Okay. Is Sergio all right? I looked through the glass door. He was washing dishes with his back to me. He'll be okay. She let out a relieved breath. I'm glad you're there. Something about that bothered me. Why? Because I knew he'd call you. I stayed silent. I always knew. Knew what? That whenever something important happened, she paused. You were the first person he wanted. The words sounded painfully familiar. She continued before I could respond. I spent months convincing myself I was imagining it. You weren't. No, I wasn't. There wasn't any anger in her voice, only sadness. I'm not calling to blame either of you. I'm sorry. So am I. Another silence. Then she asked the question I never expected. Can I tell you why I left? I leaned against the balcony railing. I'm listening. I loved him. I know. He loved me too. I closed my eyes. I know. But, her voice cracked, he never looked at me the way he looked at you. The air left my lungs. I don't mean romance, she quickly added. I mean, she searched for the words. When you walked into a room, he relaxed. When you laughed, he laughed. When you were hurting, he forgot everyone else. I couldn't compete with that. I looked back inside. Sergio was drying 2 coffee mugs, one for him, one for me. I kept waiting for him to choose me first. She sniffled quietly. He wanted to. But he never had to think about choosing you. The line went quiet again. Finally, she said, I hope one day he stops running. Then she hung up. When I walked back inside, Sergio looked at me. Emma? I nodded. What did she want? I hesitated. She wanted to know if you were okay. He smiled sadly. That's her. She also told me why she left. His hands stopped moving. Oh, she wasn't angry. I know. She said she couldn't marry someone who kept trying to convince himself. His shoulders slowly sank. I guess she finally said it out loud. You already knew. He nodded. I think part of me always did. That afternoon we drove out to the venue. Someone had to collect the decorations that hadn't been delivered. The place looked beautiful. White flowers still lined the entrance. Rows of empty chairs faced the lake. The arch where Sergio and Emma were supposed to exchange vows still stood untouched. It felt strange seeing it completely empty. The wedding coordinator greeted us with a sympathetic smile. "I'm so sorry." Sergio thanked her quietly. While she gathered paperwork, I wandered toward the lake. The chairs faced the water, perfectly arranged as if guests might arrive at any moment. "I almost married her right here." I turned. Sergio had followed me. He stood beside me, staring at the empty arch. "I spent months imagining this day." "I know. And when I pictured it," he laughed softly, "something always felt missing." I didn't answer. I thought it was nerves. He shook his head. It wasn't. The wind carried the scent of the lake across the empty ceremony space. I kept imagining looking into the crowd. He swallowed. "And making sure you were there." I looked down. "I would have been." "I know. Always." He turned toward me. "That's exactly the problem." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. It was the folded paper I'd noticed on his kitchen counter days earlier, his vows. "I don't need these anymore." He held them out. "I want you to read them." "I shouldn't." "I want you to." I unfolded the pages carefully. Most of it was exactly what I'd expected: promises, gratitude, plans for the future. Then, near the end, one sentence stopped me cold. "You taught me that home isn't a place, it's the person who makes every version of your life feel complete." I looked up. "That's beautiful." Sergio gave a sad smile. "I wasn't writing about Emma." The words hung between us as the afternoon breeze rippled across the empty rows of chairs. For the first time, neither of us looked away. I folded the vows carefully and handed them back. For a second, neither of us moved. The empty ceremony chairs stretched behind us, untouched, while the lake reflected the late afternoon sun. Sergio looked down at the pages before slipping them into his jacket. "I wrote those 2 months ago," he said quietly. "You knew then?" He nodded. "I just refused to admit it." I leaned against one of the white chairs. "So what now?" He let out a slow breath. "I honestly don't know." That was the first time in years I'd heard Sergio admit he didn't have a plan. He always had a plan. That's who he was. Except now his entire future had disappeared overnight. We spent another hour helping the venue staff pack everything away. The flower arch came down. The candles were boxed up. The white aisle runner was rolled into a tight cylinder and carried into storage. Watching it disappear felt strangely symbolic, not because a wedding had ended, because an entire version of Sergio's life had. As we loaded the last box into my truck, the wedding coordinator smiled sadly. "I hope you both find what you're looking for." Neither of us answered. I wasn't sure either of us knew what that was anymore. Instead of driving straight home, Sergio asked me to take a detour. "Can we stop somewhere?" "Sure. Old Miller's Park." I smiled. "We haven't been there in years." "I know." The park had been our place growing up. Whenever one of us had good news or terrible news, we ended up there. First jobs, college acceptance letters, breakups, my father's funeral, his mother's retirement. Life seemed to happen on those old park benches. The place hadn't changed much. The basketball court was newer, the playground had fresh paint, but our bench still overlooked the small pond. We sat down without saying anything. After a while, Sergio laughed quietly. "You remember that bet?" "Which one?" "The one when we were 20? I groaned. "Oh no. You told me I'd never settle down." "I absolutely did." "And I bet you $100 I'd be married before 30. "You owe me $100. He smiled. "I guess I do." For the first time all week, the laughter didn't feel forced. It felt familiar, like we'd somehow found our way back to ourselves. As the sun began to set, Sergio became unusually quiet again. I've been thinking, dangerous. It usually is. He stared across the pond. I keep asking myself why I proposed. I waited. I loved Emma. I know. But every time she talked about forever, he shook his head. I'd picture you. My stomach tightened. Not like that, he said quickly. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. He rubbed both hands together nervously. I imagined family dinners, vacations, buying a house, growing old, and every single picture in my head, he laughed bitterly, included you. I looked away toward the water. I convinced myself that's just what lifelong friendship looked like. And now, he was quiet for several seconds. Now I don't know if I was lying to everyone, he swallowed, or just to myself. On the drive back, neither of us turned the radio on. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was thoughtful, almost peaceful. Halfway to his apartment, my phone rang. It was Vanessa. I answered through the truck speakers. Hey, Trevor, everything okay? I was actually looking for both of you. Sergio glanced toward the dashboard. We're together. Good, she hesitated. I probably shouldn't say this. Sergio sighed. Then don't. I'm going to anyway. I couldn't help smiling. That sounded exactly like his sister. I've watched you two for 15 years, she continued. I've never interfered because I figured eventually one of you would figure it out. Sergio groaned. Vanessa, no. You listen. Her voice softened. Do you remember when Dad was in the hospital? Sergio nodded. Of course. You hadn't slept in almost 2 days. I remember. You finally fell asleep in the waiting room. Another pause. When I came back with coffee, I found Trevor asleep beside you. Neither of us spoke. You were both sitting in those awful plastic chairs. You were leaning against him. And even while you were asleep, she laughed gently. Your hand was holding onto his sleeve. I felt Sergio shift beside me. I'd never seen you look that peaceful. She continued before either of us could interrupt. That was 6 years ago. I asked Mom if she'd ever seen two best friends care about each other that much. What did she say? Sergio asked. Vanessa smiled through the phone. She said, sometimes people spend years calling something friendship because they're afraid of giving it another name. Silence filled the truck. Finally, Sergio spoke. You've all known. I think we all hoped you'd figure it out before somebody got hurt. He closed his eyes. I'm sorry. So am I. The call ended. Back at the apartment, the sun had completely disappeared. The city lights glowed through the windows. Sergio stood in the middle of the living room. I need to tell you something. I nodded. I'm listening. He took a deep breath. I spent 4 years trying to become the man Emma deserved. His eyes finally met mine, and somewhere along the way, his voice trembled. I realized I was trying to become someone who could stop loving you more than anyone else. I felt my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Sergio. He took one slow step closer. I don't know what this means. I don't know what tomorrow looks like. I don't know if I'm ready for another relationship. He stopped only a few feet away. But I know one thing. What? For the first time since I'd known him, I saw tears in his eyes that he didn't try to hide. I don't want to spend another day pretending you're just my best friend. The room fell completely silent. Neither of us moved. Neither of us looked away. For the first time in 15 years, the truth was finally standing between us. It was just waiting for one of us to take the next step. Neither of us moved. The apartment was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Sergio stood only a few feet away, his eyes fixed on mine. I don't want to spend another day pretending you're just my best friend. I'd imagined hearing those words 1,000 different ways over the years, usually while lying awake at 3 in the morning, knowing they'd never actually happen. Now that they had, I couldn't find my voice. Sergio gave a small, nervous smile. See? What? I finally say something honest. He looked down at the floor. And you don't know what to say. I took a slow breath. It's not that. Then what is it? I laughed quietly, mostly because I was overwhelmed. I've spent years preparing myself to never hear that. His shoulders relaxed just a little. So I need a second. He nodded immediately. You can have as many seconds as you want. I walked over to the window. The city lights blurred together below us. For years, I'd convinced myself loving Sergio meant wanting him to be happy, even if that happiness was with someone else. I'd accepted that. I'd buried it. I'd built an entire life around never expecting anything more. And now, everything had changed in less than a week. I turned back toward him. I have to ask you something. Anything. Are you saying this because the wedding ended? His expression didn't change. No. Because you're lonely? No. Because you're hurting? I am hurting. He stepped closer, but that's not why. He stopped about an arm's length away. I'm saying it because canceling the wedding forced me to stop lying. To you? To myself. I searched his face for any sign of doubt. Instead, I found relief. Like telling the truth had finally let him breathe again. When Emma left, he said softly, I wasn't just grieving the relationship. I waited. I was grieving the life I'd convinced myself I was supposed to want. He smiled sadly. I kept thinking marriage would somehow fix the part of me that always came back to you. My chest tightened. It never did. I slowly closed the distance between us, not because I knew what happened next, because I was tired of letting fear make every decision. You know, I said quietly, I almost skipped your wedding. His eyebrows lifted. What? I drove to the rehearsal. I know. I parked outside. He frowned. You never came in. I couldn't. I looked away for a second. I sat in my truck for almost 40 minutes. He stared at me. I kept telling myself to walk inside. What stopped you? I realized watching you promise forever to someone else. I swallowed. Might be the hardest thing I'd ever do. His eyes filled again. Trevor, but I was still going. Why? Because you asked me. I smiled through the emotion gathering in my chest. And if standing beside you was the closest I'd ever get, I shrugged softly, I would have done it. Without hesitation, Sergio reached for my hand. This time, neither of us pretended it was accidental. His fingers wrapped around mine gently, comfortably, like they'd belonged there all along. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. After a long moment, Sergio laughed quietly. You know what's funny? What? I've hugged you probably 1,000 times, at least. But right now, he smiled nervously. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. That made me laugh. Neither do I. So we're equally clueless? Looks that way. Good. He squeezed my hand. I was worried you'd suddenly become an expert. I shook my head. Not a chance. For the first time in days, the laughter felt effortless. Later that night, we ended up back on the couch, not talking about relationships, not talking about weddings, just talking about high school, about terrible jobs we'd survived, about road trips, about the time we'd gotten lost hiking because Sergio insisted he definitely knew a shortcut. I still think I was right. You led us in a circle. It was an adventurous circle. It lasted 4 hours. Worth it. It absolutely wasn't. He laughed so hard he leaned against my shoulder, then froze. So, he said carefully, is this weird now? I looked at him. No, he smiled. It actually feels, he searched for the right word, exactly the same. I nodded. Just more honest. Yeah. He looked down at our hands, still loosely intertwined. I like honest. So do I. Around midnight, we stepped onto the apartment balcony. The air was cool after the storm. The city stretched endlessly beneath us. Sergio rested his elbows on the railing. You know, he said, the wedding being cancelled felt like the end of my life. I glanced toward him. Now, he smiled. Now it feels like the first day I've actually been living my own. I didn't answer. Instead, I stood beside him, close enough that our shoulders touched. Neither of us moved away. After a long silence, he quietly asked, "Can I kiss you?" I looked into his eyes, the same eyes I'd been trying not to get lost in for years. There wasn't panic anymore, or confusion, just hope. I smiled. "I was starting to think you'd never ask." He smiled back, slowly, carefully. He lifted a hand to my face, giving me every chance to change my mind. I didn't. When our lips finally met, it wasn't rushed, it wasn't dramatic, it was gentle, patient. Years of unspoken feelings settling into one quiet moment. When we pulled apart, neither of us said anything. We just smiled. Because after 15 years, neither of us had to wonder anymore. The kiss wasn't dramatic. There was no cheering crowd, no perfect movie soundtrack, no fireworks exploding over the city. It lasted only a few seconds, but somehow it felt like 15 years had finally caught up with us. When we stepped apart, Sergio rested his forehead lightly against mine and laughed. "I can't believe I almost married someone else." I smiled sadly. "I can." He looked at me. "I spent years trying to become the person everyone expected me to be. You don't have to anymore." He nodded slowly. "I know." The next few weeks weren't magically easy. In fact, they were probably the hardest either of us had ever lived through. Sergio had painful conversations with family. He met Emma one last time to return the last of their shared belongings. I waited in the parking lot while they talked. Almost an hour later, he came back. He climbed into my truck without saying anything. "How'd it go?" I asked. He looked out the windshield. She smiled. "Really?" She told me she finally understood. He swallowed. Then she thanked me for finally being honest. I nodded quietly. "I'm glad." "So am I." He leaned back in the seat. "I'll always care about her." "I know. But she deserves someone who wakes up every morning absolutely certain." He turned toward me. "I never want to make that mistake again." A month later, Vanessa invited both of us to a family barbecue. As we stood outside her house, Sergio stopped before opening the gate. "You nervous?" He laughed. "Terrified." "We can leave." He shook his head. "No." He reached for my hand. "This time," he smiled, "I don't want to hide." We walked in together. The conversations around the yard slowly stopped. Not because people were shocked, because they finally understood. Vanessa was the first person to hug us both. "Took you too long enough." Sergio laughed. "You knew?" She rolled her eyes. "I've known since you were 24." His mother walked over next. She looked at us for a long moment before wrapping both of us in a hug. "I don't care who you love." She smiled through tears. "I only care that you finally look happy." Sergio completely broke down. I'd seen him cry only twice in 15 years. This became the third. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. There were awkward moments, questions, curious friends. Some people drifted away, others surprised us with unwavering support. Through it all, we kept doing what we'd always done: Saturday morning coffee, late night grocery runs, watching terrible action movies, arguing over who made the better burgers. The only difference was that now, when Sergio reached for my hand, neither of us pretended it meant nothing. 6 months later, we returned to the lake where his wedding had almost taken place. The venue looked completely different. Another couple was getting married that afternoon. We watched from a distance as guests laughed, children ran across the grass, and music drifted over the water. You okay? I asked. Sergio smiled. Yeah. No regrets? He thought about it. I regret hurting Emma. So do I. But canceling that wedding? He shook his head. Saved 3 lives. I looked at him. Hers. Mine. He squeezed my hand. And ours. We walked farther down the shoreline until we reached the old dock, the same place where he'd sat alone during his bachelor weekend, the same place where he'd spent hours trying to convince himself that everything would somehow work out. He leaned against the railing. I remember sitting right here. I know. I kept asking myself why something felt wrong. He laughed quietly. The answer was standing on the shore looking for me. I smiled. You should have asked sooner. I was an idiot. You were scared. I was both. As the sun began to set, Sergio reached into his jacket pocket. I recognized the folded paper immediately. His wedding vows. You still have those? I do. He unfolded them one last time. Then, without reading them, he smiled. I don't need these anymore. He tore the pages carefully into small pieces. One by one, he dropped them into a recycling bin beside the dock. I raised an eyebrow. I thought you were going to throw them into the lake. He looked horrified. And litter? I laughed. Good point, he grinned. I'm trying to be a better man. You already are. On the drive home, the windows were down. Warm summer air filled the truck. The radio played softly in the background. Sergio rested his hand over mine on the center console. You know something? What? If someone had told 18-year-old me that I'd fall in love with my best friend, he laughed. I'd have said they were insane. What about 25-year-old you? I would have panicked. And 30-year-old you? He smiled at me. He finally stopped running. I squeezed his hand. I'm glad. So am I. Sometimes people think love begins with a first date, or a first kiss, or the moment two strangers meet. Ours didn't. It began with 15 years of friendship, thousands of ordinary days, countless late night conversations, showing up for each other without keeping score. It just took us a long time to realize that what we'd been building all along was never just friendship. People still ask Sergio what it was like having his wedding canceled the night before. He always smiles before answering. It was the worst day of my life. Then he looks at me, and the best one, because losing the future he thought he wanted led him to the life that had been waiting beside him all along.